Welcome back. This is week 16, lecture 2, which is really not a lecture. It is simply a talk about preparing for the final exam. By this time in the course, if you're watching this, I hope you're working and beginning to work anyway on your final. It is, as I hope you all know too, very important because the whole purpose of the course is to lead to the final, where the midterms are designed to help you prepare for the final exam. So that if you do better on the final exam than you have on one or both of the midterms, the percentage grade on the final exam will replace your midterm grades. And so the final exam could be worth a substantial part of your grade. Um, because for me, that's the whole goal of the course. That's it's what's important is what you come out of the course with and what you have kind of learned and gotten, so to speak, at the end of the course, more than what kind of busy work you do along the way. Which I don't mean to de-emphasize the quizzes or the midterms or the lab reports. Those are all very much important, but they're all designed to gear you towards the final and help prepare for the final. So that being said, just things that you should already know, but I just want to go over with you again. Number one, that is to pay attention and good attention to the guide to writing the final exam, which is posted in course documents. It will walk you through what is expected and required and follow the instructions. That's an important part of the exam because it shows that you are paying attention, basically. And the list of terms to know. Now, if you look at the list of terms to know for the final exam, that list includes terms to know only since the second midterm. And it states at the beginning that also the list of terms to know for midterm 1 and midterm 2 are part of the terms to know for the final. But if you've already done the midterms, you should know those terms more or less. But that's kind of the basic summary, so to speak, of the expected information. It is take home, and so there should be no real excuse for getting things wrong, so to speak, in terms of names and dates and things like that. But the more effort you put into this, the better it will be. Now, there is a PowerPoint presentation for this talk preparing for the exam. And if we look at it there, we have 4 points: introduction, an evidence, argument, and make your case. And those are really the essential aspects of doing well in the exam, which has been the same for the 2 midterms. Same thing applies to the final. So I want to go through with you the final question, and then we'll come back to those aspects, the evidence and the argument, and making your case. So if you have it before, you might want to look at the final question. I'm just going to read it to you. It is a long question and a complex question. That's a given. So in some ways, part of the exam is simply to analyze the question to see what is it really asking. So here we go. Here's the question. Western civilization, from the emergence of civilization itself to the onset of early modern Europe, can be seen as a continuous struggle for justice, how effectively to achieve as just a state as possible as humans sought to govern themselves. That which was just was defined based on a given group, state, or culture, which then often did not apply to the other, which was usually seen as the enemy, quote unquote. Yet Plato had argued that if there is something that can be considered justice, it is universal and must apply to all. If justice is group-specific, can it then not be reduced to individual interpretations, whereby what justice is defined as what justice means to me? Is an individualized understanding of or definition of justice not then the basis for what Thomas Hobbes in the mid-17th century considered to be the state of nature, where life was poor, nasty, brutish, and short, based on individual sovereignty? Governments, from the emergence of civilization, sought to assume sovereignty to provide for a just state for their citizens. To do so, they used myth, to both legitimize their own rule and to form a group identity. What, then, was the relationship between myth and justice from the emergence of civilization to approximately 1600? How did that relationship change over time, or did it? Is not the union of myth and justice that which provides the identity of Western civilization, whereby the relationship between myth and justice is what makes civilization itself Western? Is not Western civilization itself not simply the myth of the West? Trace the origins, development, and impact of the myth of the West, or the ideology of the West, based on the varying understandings of the relationship between myth and justice, from the rise of civilization as such to approximately 1600, and be sure to treat 1. The emergence and development of ancient civilizations, including Greece; 2. The Augustan Revolution and the so-called fall of Rome, including the rise of Christianity; 3. The emergence and development of Christendom; and 4. The emergence and development of early modern Europe. When did civilization become uniquely and distinctively Western? What made it so? Is Western civilization then simply an idea, or how could it be defined other than as a myth? Is Western civilization then simply an idea, or how could it be defined? Oh, I've already read it. Sorry, that's a repetition. Is Western civilization perhaps, too, simply the myth of justice and the just state? Answer these questions based on the course materials, textbook, lectures, and readings, and be sure to give specific details and examples. In other words, present as strong of an argument for your position as you can. Now, that is a lot. The first half of that question, what I just read to you, though, is setting the stage, so to speak. The actual question gets at what then was the relationship between myth and justice from the emergence of civilization to approximately 1600. Now, I had already set up that myth was used by various cultures and civilizations and countries and groups to justify their attempts to govern themselves, or their people, that is, justly. In that sense, this using of myth and use of myth as justice, does not that lead to the question of, is not this concept of justice, myth itself, mythic? And that if justice itself is a myth, is that not then the same as the myth of the West? Because I began this course with problematizing the terms of the title, the history of Western civilization. What constitutes being Western? It all depends on one's point of observation. That is what this is getting at. If it is an idea, if the West is an idea rather than a particular geographical boundary, because it all depends on what is West to where you are, then is it not the idea or the ideology or the myth of the West that constitutes Western civilization? Now, that is a theme I've tried to kind of continue throughout, and that's your term paper 2 on Plato's Republic, is tried to help you with this concept of justice and how is it defined. This exam is not asking you to define justice for yourself or to base your answer based on what you think is justice or just, and then look back to see where you find it. That would be not the most helpful approach. The question is, you need to ask yourselves, is what is justice? Whatever you might think justice is, or a just state, what it would look like. Try to bracket that off, so to speak, at least in terms of the exam, and say, okay, that is one thing how I think of it. How was it seen at the time? Whether or not I think that is just or not. How was it seen at the time? What example? Is there any example that we've seen this semester of a civilization, a country, an empire, a community that thought of itself as saying, we are going to be unjust. We're not going to be a just state. We're going to be something else? I don't think so. Certainly not in any of the documents that I've talked about or the examples that we've looked at. So the question is not this absolute, almost in a Platonic sense, of what is absolute justice, but rather, how did people understand it at the time? And then how did that change over time? That is what we're getting at and what the question is getting at. Because the whole basis of it is to say, okay, really, and this is why Plato is so important, and your term paper, I think, is so important. It forces us to ask the question, what really then is justice? And on what basis do we make that determination? Because if I think X is just, and if you think Y is just, but X does not equal Y, there's a conflict. How is that conflict solved? Are we both right? Or is only one of us right? If those are contradictory positions, we both can't be right, so one of us is right and one of us isn't. But how do we make that determination? On what basis? Is it law? Is it theology or philosophy? How do we determine what is just and what is justice and what is a just state? That is what this is getting at, because as I've tried to portray the development of Western civilization this semester, the entire history of Western civilization has been ongoing attempts to answer those questions for the people themselves at the times. Which does not mean that it's the question that we would offer or that we would agree with. But how and why did they view things the way they did? And then to trace that development from the 4 different periods that I demarcate there, the emergence and development of ancient civilizations, the Augustan Revolution, the so-called fall of Rome, the emergence and development of Christendom, and the emergence and development of early modern Europe. That is really the heart of the exam. And when then, in that development, did civilization, which I've stressed, when it arose, was common. It was not distinctively and uniquely Western. But when did civilization become distinctly and uniquely Western? And is that then perhaps not simply the myth of justice in the just state when we first start to see civilization as being uniquely and distinctively Western? And is it not simply the same as the myth of the West itself? Now, I hope that kind of helps in terms of approaching the exam conceptually, because that's what it's really getting at. And I've tried, again, to structure the midterms and the discussions and everything else along those lines to help prepare for this final exam. So the conceptual aspect of it is very important. But so are the details. And that is where we get then to the PowerPoint slide in terms of the evidence argument and making your case. As I've stressed before, the evidence on which you can base your argument is the course material, the lectures in the textbook, and your term paper, Plato's Republic. Anything that has been assigned, and that is the basis for, will be the basis for my grading your final exam. How well do you apply the course material to answering the question? If you cite the lectures, if you cite the textbook, if you cite Plato, that demonstrates that you're basing your argument on evidence, because that is your evidence in terms of this course, in terms of this question. The more you can use, the more details and specifics, the more evidence you can bring, the better it is. And I've said this before, equating historical argument with legal argument. What is the body of evidence available? And then do you present every possible piece of evidence to the judge when you present your case in court? No, you have to make a selection. You also have to deal with potential evidence that might undermine your own position. So you have to deal with, evidence that that perhaps signifies the opposite argument that you're trying to make. And if you can show that that evidence actually supports your view, the better, because if you're the defense attorney, that the prosecutor, if you're the prosecutor, the defense attorney is going to be doing the same thing with the evidence. And that's what historians do constantly. We argue about the evidence that's there and what does it mean, and that's what we're getting at. That is what we're getting at. It's not so much the pieces of information, what does it all mean? It's one thing to say the Treaty of Verdun was signed in 843. It's another thing to say, what did that mean? What impact and effect did that have? That is where the argument comes in. This final gives you the last chance in this course to adopt the role of the historian and make a case, make your argument. And your argument will be stronger the better you use the evidence and the more evidence you bring to support your position and your argument. That's what it is. So you need to state a thesis. That gets with the argument part. State a thesis on that development. Is the myth of the West, the myth of justice, and how that developed. Is that equated with the myth of the West? And how do we see that, and why and where? Yes, no, partly, partly not. There's no given. It's not like one or two options. How do you put it all together? In some ways, that is what this question is trying to give you a structure for doing, to say, okay, we've had this entire semester. What sense do you make of it? How do you put it all together? Not so much what do you think about justice or religion or politics or society from your own perspective, but based on the course material, how do you see it all working together? That's what this is getting at. Now, the more evidence you bring, the stronger your argument is, the better you will make your case. Also, the more polished your argument is, the better you will make your case. That means, too, proofread. Follow the instructions and proofread to make sure there are no easily fixable errors that will gleam and signify to me, I don't care. That's what they do. It's not that big of a deal if you misspell something or don't have the correct punctuation or something. For me, that's not that big of a deal as long as I know what you're trying to say. But what it says to me is you don't care enough to go back and make sure it's the best you can do. Put your best foot forward. When you submit your final, you're submitting yourself. It's your work. It's your understanding of what you've done this entire semester. And you're making your case. As I've said before, too, I'm not going to be grading your opinions. And so if you start talking about what you consider to be justice and how Plato was wrong because Plato doesn't understand what justice is and you do, that's not going to help. Because I'm not going to grade those opinions. I can grade how well you defend your analysis of the course material. That's what I'll be grading. So I'm not asking you to say, tell me what you think about justice in the Western tradition. I'm asking you to say, based on the course material, we can see this development. What impact did it have? Or were people not interested in justice? What evidence is there for that? Now, we've seen just a very little bit of this tradition in this course, necessarily. I know that. But based on what we have seen, what can you say? How does it work? Are there competing views? What's the difference between Plato's view of justice and Augustine's view of justice, or Thomas Aquinas' view of justice, or the view of justice implicit within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, or the lay hierarchy, or with the King of France, and on we could go. And how does that change how does the view of justice change once we see the crumbling of Christendom and the beginnings of the emergence of early modern Europe? Is some of those changing paradigms not based simply on changing views of justice and where justice is to be found and what's the basis of it? How do we get at that? So again, keep asking yourself. I don't think anyone out there has ever said, I'm going to create an unjust state. I'm going to rule an unjust state. Even if we don't consider it to be just. That's the issue. And then to look at understandings of justice in the past and say, how was that possible? Are we missing something with our understanding? And that's the reference to Hobbes. And Hobbes is not part of this course. But this concept of the state of nature for Hobbes was that every individual is a sovereign in and of themselves. And he says, in that kind of a state, life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Because it's just the survival of the fittest. Is that just? Is individualism just? Where does it all come about? Is there justice if there is imposed coercive authority to establish justice? Is that just? How do we get at this concept within the development of the Western tradition? Now, you're welcome to email me with questions about that. You're welcome to send me drafts. Again, I think I've said this before. If everybody sends me a draft the night before this is due, I won't be able to get to it. So, especially with finals, and I'll be posting an announcement about this. But I have a very short turnaround between your final due date, which is 99% sure it's December 20th at 11:59. And when I have to submit final grades. So I will not be offering feedback on your final or on your term paper. I will happily do so after final grades are submitted. I'm pretty sure I've said this for the midterms. To it, maybe not, but I can always change your grade. And if you can show me that I have misgraded your midterm or your final, and convince me of that, I will happily change your grade if I've assigned you a too low of a grade. I will never lower your grade if I go back through it and say, well, no, actually, I think I was too generous. I've never had a case, aside from mathematics. I have every once or twice made an error in my math. But I've never had a case where a student's come in and I said, oh, yeah, you're right, that wasn't really fair after a final or a term paper. I have had that on a midterm every once in a while. Very rarely, but I have. And I raise the grade. But it's not, it's usually the case where it's like, no, I was really too generous on this because, here's all the reasons why. But I encourage you to come in. If you don't understand what grade you got or why you got it, come talk to me. That's a help in the learning process continues. So do that. And with the drafts, I'm happy to read drafts. First come, first served basis. But if everybody sends me a draft on December 18th, I will not be able to get to them, so I won't. And students rarely send me drafts. I understand that, but I always make the offer, and I always feel I have to make the caveat that if I'm inundated with drafts shortly before the due date, I won't be able to get to them. I'm not going to get only to a few of them because that would not be fair. So keep that in mind. But questions, whatever we can talk about, if you want to have an individual talk over Zoom about your final, I'm happy to do that. But really put your best effort into it, formally as well as substantively. And have fun with it. I know that may be, you're saying that's a perverse thing to say. It's like, okay, well, I understand that. But it should be something that maybe even after the fact that you can look back and think, yeah, that was kind of fun, struggling with this concept and how to understand it in the past, how to put it together. And then what difference does that make for our understanding? That's the part I'm not going to grade, but I want you to think about. Both with the term paper and with the final. Why do we think what we think justice is? On what basis do we think that? Why? Is it really that way? If we start to analyze it. You've read Plato's Republic. You know that was the whole problem, starting to question different definitions of justice. And how do we come up with a definition of justice? It wasn't just an assertion being thrown out there. It was based on questioning, analyzing. How do we devise as just a state as possible? Now, that's what this course has been about, in my view, for this chronological period. A lot more underneath that. I hope that you've gotten a lot more out of this course than thinking about justice. But that is kind of the core part of it that I've tried to continue through as the thread, because there's others that we can look at as well. Even though justice can be pretty broad, social, economic justice, those types of things, as well as philosophical ideas, theological ideas, all kinds of different ideas of justice and what is just, and on what basis. Is individualism the only basis for determining that which is just? Is it a basis at all? Because then that brings us right back then to Hobbes. That's the dilemma, kind of either Plato or Hobbes. And what was Hobbes' solution to the state of nature? The absolute state, the Leviathan. How to kind of navigate those. I hope you have enjoyed this course. I always enjoy teaching it. I've enjoyed teaching it this semester. I wish we could do this in person rather than online. But still, I've enjoyed it. I try and make the best of it. And I'm looking forward to reading your final exams. I really am. And I hope you'll find it a useful and helpful and valuable exercise. I'm not oblivious or such an idealist. I know also that you're not interested in getting a good grade or on this. So I hope that will, the more work and the more effort you put into it, the better your grade will be. I can almost guarantee that. I'm not going to say that for sure, but I can almost guarantee that the more effort and work you put into it, the better it will be. If you have any questions, just ask. And I think that about covers it for now in terms of sharing with you the aspects that I think are important for the final. I would say reread too the document historical argument. That could be a real help. Because the stronger your argument is, the better your exam will be. I'm the judge. You have to present your case with the evidence and a good, strong argument to convince me. That's your task. Good luck with it. Enjoy. And I wish you all the best. Take care.